Thanks for coming to the lecture today. My name is Alan Cicco, and I am a resident of Fairborn. As you can see on the flyer for the talk, I am listed as a thanatologist, which is a person who studies death and bereavement. I went to Hood College in Frederick, Maryland for this. There's only a few universities in the world that focus on this topic, and Hood College is one of them. The topic of thanatology and death and bereavement is such a overarching and wide-sweeping area that it's literally impossible for anyone in existence to study it all. You have to hone in and focus on specific aspects of it that you want to research, write about, discuss, or whatever you want to do on that topic. For me, I have a large extent and variety of things I have focused on and have in my library. I've also counseled as a death and bereavement counselor on top of it. In my own personal practice, I'm also a Buddhist priest, and in our tradition, the images of death and impermanence and the symbolism such as bones and the corpse and such is incredibly prevalent throughout almost all of the traditions, regardless of which one, because impermanence is an important topic for us because it pretty much laces everything in existence in our universe regardless of the object. Death and bereavement in the U.S. Pretty much in our beginning as a country had its foundation in the English common law and Puritan ideology and symbolism of the corpse and death, which was really not in itself the most prettiest symbolism we associate with kind of like a beautiful death and such that we are somewhat used to now in our society to a certain extent. So the idea of the corpse began to evolve, and as the more Puritan, the more Protestant ideas came into play in the U.S., a more complex relationship with the corpse began to evolve, and it wasn't looked at as such a just almost gross, useless object. It had a lot of symbolic value. Misuse of a corpse before the Civil War was considered a very socially unacceptable thing to ever do. In fact, if a corpse was, let's say, buried improperly, there was a reason for it. You were a criminal, a rapist, a horse thief, whatever, and it was considered a form of social ostracization of putting your corpse in not a very considered loving place. Buried at a crossroads and such things. There's a lot of symbolism involved in that. As the Civil War began to take place in 1861 to 1865, the overall psyche of the U.S. population was utterly shocked to its core when it came to the relationship with the dead. The first and foremost reason was there had never been that level of death ever in the history of the U.S. The deaths involved in the Civil War were around almost 500,000 people, over 400,000. The consciousness of the U.S. citizens trying to cope with this, they just didn't have the tools to deal with it. There was no way to know or realize this was going to happen. In fact, the idea that that many people would die was never even thought of when the Civil War began to happen. They didn't think it would happen. Even the first skirmish wasn't such a big deal, but following that, the bodies began to adamantly pile up very quickly, and because of this, people realized what a shock this was going to be to every sensibility associated with the corpse in our country. The precursor of the way the body was viewed before the Civil War was you died with your family, you were buried on your farmland or in areas where your loved ones were at. women normally prepared the body, but women weren't allowed to even attend funerals. It wasn't considered norm for a female to be near the burial, even taking the body to the place of burial. It was very segregated. And beyond and above the way women were treated, the minorities in the country, especially the blacks, were like really on the receiving end of harsh treatment as to what was allowed to be done with the bodies. There wasn't a lot of mercy when it came to anybody but just the white male to start with. During the Civil War, the relationship to the image of the body began to change because people in the battlefield began to see so many bodies and started actually writing home about it to the North, that people were very shocked about what was happening with just the loss of life and the fact that the bodies of their loved ones weren't home. And that was a big deal. They were in the South. And the philosophy of the succession of the Confederacy to the Union, from the Union, was considered morally a very reprehensible thing socially in the U.S. Because of this, going to the South and pretty much kind of punishing them for it was an overarching reasoning for the war. So when somebody died on the battlefield, it was considered a noble sacrifice. And this has been carried over into today with the symbolism associated with the soldier and their death. Now, this did change during the Vietnam War with the whole social change, and the death of a soldier for a lot of society wasn't considered a noble cause. But then that changed and started to be altered as time went on after that. The imagery of the body, the symbolism of the black man in the U.S. was actually used as an image to denote the negativity of the way a corpse appeared. They would actually write articles and say, it was so horrible, the corpses looked like the Negro. And it's like, what? That's their mentality back then. Which actually goes to show that the foundation of the war was not one for the emancipation of the slaves. Later on, that became attached to it. And actually, it took about a year or two before the imagery of the noble black man began to arise, because in give me a second. 1850, the second year of the war, there was an infantry of black soldiers, which a lot of people to this day don't really know about, and they
were they called the Buffalo Soldiers?
It was the, excuse me for not having this immediately right in front of me, my apologies. It was an all-black infantry. I forget the name. I don't have the name of them. They were the 54th Infantry, and they were at the assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina in July of 1863. Almost half of them died. It was considered an extremely horrible battle, and they were raised up as utter heroes for doing that and sacrificing themselves for the continuance of the Union. So no longer the symbolism of the corpse being like, the black man was, well, the black man's just like any other white soldier dying. Now, this didn't mean that it was across the board with everybody like that, but the symbolism written about in Harper's Weekly and other magazines and other journals portrayed them as very heroic, fighting for the stabilization of the Union. Now, the fear of dying, not only not at home, but also in the South, was really rammed home with the fact that they started to see objects appearing on Confederate soldiers and in their homes that were made from the bones of Union soldiers. Such a utter barbaric behavior was considered so inflammatory to even be done by the Northerners that the Southerners were just seen as less than human for even doing such a thing. They would find soup bowls and cups made of skulls. They would find bone rings. They would go into Confederate soldiers' homes, and there would be like rib bones lining the walls they took from Union soldiers. They even found in one house the Confederate soldier's baby had a bone rattle. So when they found these things, the level of disgust and social repulsion was heightened to a level that if a war or a skirmish was seen as more Union soldiers were lost than Confederate, it was terrifying because they thought the Confederates won. They were then going to defoul the bodies. So it was a very fearful thing to die, not only in the South, but with that occurring, to have your body then destroyed and turned into an object of fascination for the barbaric Southern soldiers. The Protestant idea of the body, because of the level of death, began to change, and they began to create mass manners in which to deal with such large levels of death. There were more associations with mass burial, get all the bodies into a grave, get them buried. There wasn't a chance to put a headstone or even a piece of wood. This also, because of the way the level of the bodies were being piled up, this gave rise to what was the precursor to World War I dog tags, and soldiers would start attaching implements of information about themselves to their coats and shirts so people could start marking it down. Now, this also changed with the association of women to the corpse, because women started taking a major role in the relationship with the dying and the dead. And there were multitudes of organizations created by women that were later reinforced with federal funding and recognition under Lincoln and such, that allowed them to go into the battlefield, retrieve bodies, start writing down who died, start mailing letters to the bereaved wives and children. So this is where this actually came from, and such things as large mass cemeteries that we now know for soldiers started coming about and were actually federally funded, because the idea of dying and being a corpse in the function of protecting the Union and the country was considered such a valuable sacrifice that you were giving a specially funded place and your body was recognized and buried. Now, the idea of embalming was not a normal thing until the Civil War came about. Embalming is such a normal thing for us in our society that most people think, well, I wonder how long this has been around. Really not, for the most part, until the Civil War. The fact of those bodies being in the South and not being able to get back to the North gave rise to the idea that the federal government says, we're going to start paying for embalmers to go down there and start preparing these bodies and get them back to get them back to northern soil. So it was very important for the wholeness of the body. And there was a colonel who was killed in Virginia and shot in the chest with a double-barrel shotgun by a racist Southern person. And his body was embalmed and prepared in such a beautiful manner and looked so lifelike that they actually toured it around and showed people what was able to be done. So people said, I want that done to my husband, soldier, brother, uncle, whatever. And that's where it really took root. Back in the beginnings of the war, you actually saw banners for embalmers hanging and being advertised in local papers, and that had never occurred. But it became so important to get your relative back, males, that it was utterly almost against the consciousness to think, I don't want my kid embalmed or whatever. Now, there were some people who wrote very scathing articles about how it was atrocious to do this to a body. But as we see today, that's not really the normal occurrence. In fact, myself, working in the funeral industry, I've met funeral directors who think anybody who doesn't want their loved one embalmed, that's almost reprehensible to them. That a body just being allowed to rot and be viewed that way is so outrageous to some funeral directors that they're very taken aback when people don't want embalming done. I did work with a family that wanted their mother, wife, who had been hit by a car, to not be embalmed. Unfortunately, because of the damage, we had to tightly wrap the body and put it in the coffin, and then after the viewing, immediately take the body out and take it to the incinerator because of the consistent decay that was setting in so quickly. Unfortunately, I also got hit with juices from the body while taking it to the incinerator, so that's one of the side effects of not embalming. The only time after the Civil War that we saw death levels equivalent to the Civil War was in 1918 when the influenza epidemic hit, and then we saw 500 to 650,000 people die in the U.S. A lot of people think that the influenza of 1918 was greater than the Black Death of the 1300s, but that's actually not true. The Black Death killed about 10% of the world population. The influenza only killed about 5%, and not as of a gross demise, really. And in the time frame, obviously, that we had in 1918, after the Civil War, with the induction of all of these civil and federal groups that began to take care of disposal of the body, it was much more easier to deal with mass casualties like that of the influenza, World War I, World War II, etc. And of course, with the embalming techniques, the later wars, it was a lot easier to embalm the body and bring it back to the U.S. for a proper burial. The purview changed as time progressed. The industry of the embalmers became undertakers, became funeral directors, and morticians. So the name began to change. The idea of a coffin to a casket and the commodification of death began to rise as an extremely profitable business for the U.S. and really around the world, disregarding other cultures where that's not really done. It depends on where you're at in location around the world. Because of the profitability of death, we have seen in the U.S. the rise of where back in the Civil War, you could get embalmed and your body returned for $7. Fast forward now in the U.S. and you go to some funeral homes and you're talking $6,000 to $8,000. $7, $8,000. There's no reason for that. And the only reason for that is because of the government stepping in and really privatizing death in the U.S. We have seen the rise in the U.S. and in society of the taking away of the personal identity with death. Most people are not at home and they're not with their loved one in a relaxed setting when they die. The numbers associated with it right now, 80% of Americans want to die at home. Now, all of you think, how many people do you know that don't go to a hospital and die, or hospice? There's not a lot in most people's circles. And this has happened because in the 1800s and then into the 1900s, the commissions in the cities that were associated with health of the city started focusing on documented studies involved with corpses in urban settings. So because of the really propaganda that was pushed on the US citizens, the idea of somebody dying and a body staying wherever it died and like just rotting there, or just taking your time to recover and do something with it, was pushed as a very fearful idea because of the toxicity and diseases associated with the body. Of course, this is even heightened when it comes to things like influenza, Ebola, H1N1, whatever that's going around that causes the death of the individual. On top of that, you have a heightened, almost hysteria of the body not being recovered and like gotten out of there to somewhere to be taken care of. And really, it's a meat locker. That's where it's taken care of when it involves the city and the state. Now, of course, the bodies are stored in cooled areas and immediately embalmed when it has to do with the funeral home going to get the body and recovering it if there doesn't need to be a coroner's medical examination because of not knowing why they died. Was it foul play, whatever the cause, or if it's suicide also. That's another aspect of there has to be an autopsy usually, unless the family steps in and says, we're not going to do that. There is a lot of power you have in some regards with your death now in our environment than there was in the past 100 years, because it has waned back and forth as to what is allowed to be done with your body by you or your loved ones. Originally, women would bathe and prepare the body in the U.S. This kind of continued and then began being separated when the funeral industry took over. In the following years of the Civil War, the S.R. Lippincott, who was the secretary of the Funeral Directors National Association in the U.S., stated in 1883 in Rochester, New York, at their second annual meeting, that they needed an honorable scientific way to preserve the corpse. They really pushed the idea on the American public, preserve, preserve, preserve. The natural death was not considered honorable, and they really heightened this rhetoric in U.S. society and continually pushed it on the American public over and over and over again. And likewise, of course, we saw their wealth go up and their control of the corpse go up also. So it is no stretch of the imagination that behind the honorable idea of preparing the corpse for proper viewing and disposal was a massive marketing campaign. You won't hear a lot of people in the industry say that. We're going to take a second break and then we will continue and be right back. All right, continuing. We also saw, as time progressed and we got into the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, we also saw a more prevalent control of the body not being allowed to, the person not being allowed to die in their house. Now, there was a multitude of reasons. At the beginning of the 19th century, of course, at the beginning of the 20th century, we saw even the language begin to change from the parlor, which was the room where the corpse was viewed, to becoming the living room, so that the body, symbolically with the language associated with the house, was not meant to be viewed there and not meant to stay there. Get it out and get it to the proper legal and professional people who need to deal with it. And this ingrained in the psyche of the American public that to have a good death, you needed professionals to do everything for you. Now, the clergy, of course, involved in this industry, if they're worth their weight in salt, they don't care where you're at. They should be by your side, whether it's at the hospital, whether it's at hospice, or whether it's at your house. And really, if clergy understand the minds of their congregation, they should be letting them relax in their natural home environment and have a comfortable way to die at home. Hospice can come to their house and let them die there, or go to a nicer, happy setting at a hospice facility as opposed to the whitewash, bland setting of a hospital, which is by far natural. If you go to any normal human being's house, to have a complete room that is completely white, you would think something is wrong with the person. Normal human beings don't just have a whitewashed room that they sleep and relax in. It just doesn't happen. So to go to a hospital and have a person who is sick and dying in an environment that's not comfortable and visually, audibly, and sensually pleasing is very disruptive to the dying process of a human being and not healthy in any shape or form for a comfortable passing. And this has caused a problem in the fact that a lot of people are not being allowed to die where they comfortably want to. 60% of people normally die in a medical facility when 80% of them want to die at home. That's already a complete disconnect with what people want to do. So somebody along that line is not listening to them and they're not doing a proper job. They're worried about get that body into that bed and start racking up those bills. And if anybody's had to deal with a loved one dying or yourself having a near-death experience or a death experience and coming back, the bill associated with that is extremely high. And the money you would have afterwards to then rebuild your life is many times sucked dry from family members who need to have something to help them on after the passing of their loved one, especially if it's a significant other that financially helped and supports you. On top of that, about 20% of people die in nursing homes and only about 20% are allowed to die at home. Now, many times, the people who are allowed to die at home, it's by accident or you have a heart attack in your sleep. It's not normally allowed to where your doctor says, you're going to die in about 3 or 4 months. Let's prepare to put you. And the person says, no, I'm just going to go, hang at home and watch soap operas and crack open a beer and pass on. They would say like, oh, no, Mr. Jordan, we can't allow you to do that. That's not the proper way to die. So already the industry is telling you how you need to approach death. And that's very emotionally complex for human beings to have that power taken away from you. We saw this come to rise to the surface during the 80s and such, when Dr. Kevorkian got involved in assisted suicide. Does everybody know who that is, right? Okay. I personally, being a thanatologist, think the gentleman's a hero, and I know some people regurgitate when I say that out of utter disgust. But if you've ever had a loved one who wants to die because they're in insufferable pain and they just want to get it over with, and it's nothing against their spiritual, psychological, religious beliefs, who is to tell you you can't end your life? The fact that the state, if you kill yourself and you don't die, can lock you up for committing suicide to yourself, that's insanity to even have laws governing that. Now, Kevorkian went through the system legally for helping people allow themselves to pass on with this suicide machine, which actually now you can create via 3D printer online and download the specs for your own house now. The Self-Determination Act was passed in 1990, just in 1990, 28 years ago, where the hospital must inform the patient of their treatment options. Before that, they could literally shotgun you with whatever they thought in their regards to keep you alive. You weren't allowed to really say, doc, I don't want any more morphine. Can I just please die in the next hour? Oh no, we need to keep you going as long as we can. And the idea that these doctors are doing it out of compassion for you, when they're not listening to you say, I don't want to, be helped anymore and get bills for my loved one, I don't think it's compassion that's at work. I think it's financing for the hospital. Oregon legalized euthanasia in 1994, thank goodness. There was a Pulitzer Prize-winning play called Wit in 1997 that lambasted the tyrannical treatment of patients at hospitals not letting themselves stop treatment. And it became very popular, and it raised awareness about really the predatory manner in which hospitals treated their patients. Public policies, because of this, began to change. The next real association with the face of death really came to rise in the 1980s with the AIDS epidemic. That's really what brought it to the forefront. Society and political figures at the time, unlike hospital nurses and clergy, and of course the gay community, they knew what was going on in the outright epidemic that was occurring and the suffering associated with the death. This really created a very strong palliative care in the U.S. and the rise of the hospice organizations that helped these people die with dignity with what they were going through, and also the use of cannabis and morphine and opiates for pain reduction. The privatization of death and dying and medical treatment has really created a conflict of interest when it comes to your rights as a human being with individual desire, concerns, and cares. You need to be very wary of predatory people playing upon your situation, and this has given rise in the U.S. to where when a loved one that you know dies, you can be almost, and you can literally time it within the next couple days, you will start receiving emails, calls, cell phone calls, and pamphlets in the mail from lawyers asking, does somebody need to be sued? Number one, unless these scum are trolling the obituaries, they shouldn't know about your loved one's death. It's getting out through the medical records, people working in those industries, and their relationships with these lawyers' offices where they're giving them information about who's passing away, and that buck comes back to the people who are giving this. I know this for a fact because I have talked to people that do this and have found out that this has gone on. There are other things associated with the corpse in the U.S. that is really coming to surface that is very disconcerting about the remains of us and our loved ones. Death in the U.S. has really taken on an almost unrealistic face to where anything associated with the idea of impermanence, be it imagery associated with death, gray hair, sagging skin, age spots, graying complexion, decrepitness, the idea of dying and impermanence is almost utterly whitewashed in our culture. And by whitewash, I mean literally caked with dyes, makeups, clothes, and imagery that associates the idea of coming to grips with your own impermanence and dying is utter terrifying for most people. They don't want to talk about it and deal with it. This has created in the U.S. a problem to where people don't have ritual for passing on. They don't know how to deal with it with their loved ones, and they don't know how to deal with it with the idea of themselves coming to die someday. It is not taught in normal institutions, and in fact, there are, unfortunately, a lot of religious institutions in our culture that don't even want to deal with the idea of death, and they just say, well, put it off till you die and you go before whoever. Well, that's not really dealing with the idea of living in the present moment in dealing with your idea of impermanence. And people are very almost like their minds are schizophrenic when it comes to how do I emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, and literally physical deal with the idea of everybody around me dying, my loved ones, my pets, my friends, and myself. And people are not educated on it in our society. A lot of us counselors will sometimes have to be brought into schools, especially elementary schools, when their classmates die, because most children are not taught by their parents or their community at large how do you deal with a young child dying, because most people don't think, oh, well, they're young, it's not going to happen to them. And that's a completely unrealistic idea. Yes, we are living longer. Yes, we are, for the most part, being kept alive a little healthier into our old age. But death can come at any second. We are all literally walking towards the grave every minute we're alive. And unfortunately, media, propaganda, music, and the idea of the partying youth, nobody wants to think about any moment you could be nailed by a car, or like some microscopic bug could fall on you and you wake up the next day in a hospital with heart failure and your lungs are filled up with liquid. Who thinks about that? Everybody's too busy working 80 hours a week. So we need to kind of take back in our society the idea of becoming comfortable with death. And this is occurring slowly but surely in our society. And there are people like myself who are thanatologists, some counselors, some clergy, and many funeral directors and morticians who are getting involved with educating the public about mortis, death. And there is even one mortician, her name is Caitlin Doherty, and in 2011 she created the Order of Good Death. And it involves a multitude of people involved in a variety of fields that want to talk about and permeate our culture with the idea of death. Going back to Europe, citizens literally used to have carnivals and parties in the graveyards and cemeteries, dancing on someone's grave. That's where that came from. Bodies used to be set up and posed in scenes, and people would have picnics and go through the cemeteries, the necropolis, and have a great time becoming face to face with impermanence and what they're going to become. Now, can you imagine that happening in, like, let's say not Fairborn, we're a Halloween town, we love it here, but going to like a normal city, like in Thailand, where they have skeletons and corpses displayed in big glass boxes you can stop at and reflect on. That's what you're going to become. You're going to become a corpse. Remember that in everything you do. And so if you can imagine setting up a couple boxes like that throughout New York City and just watch what the populace does, if they even look up from their iPhones or blabbing on the phone and think about, death. Yeah, I never thought about that in my day-to-day troubles. And that's the problem. Now, back with the Civil War, the idea of women becoming very intimate with the corpse, the Order of Good Death has 36 members and only 8 are male. So we're really seeing that in the U.S., women really are on the forefront with bringing about education in being comfortable with the corpse, with the dying. And this really kind of goes back to this splitting of the archetype role model we see in societies of the stern fighting soldier on a Civil War battlefield not having the time to deal with the corpse, and the mothering, loving, giving birth female mother type helping the dead son into the grave. So that separation still runs true in our culture today. There is a stereotype that men are supposed to be stern and not cry at funerals, and it's utter rubbish, and it's destructive to men not to. Likewise, if a woman's stern and controlled at a funeral, people think something's wrong with her and she's unfeeling. So unfortunately, the societal image of how human beings should grieve and how they should approach death is all discombobulated, and media really plays a prevalent role in this, unfortunately. But it is changing, it is evolving, and there is a lot of hope for the Western society to become a lot more comfortable with the idea of death and the corpse. And we are seeing this with the rise of a wide extent of funeral practices. There are people getting their bodies cryogenically frozen. There are people who are creating in their communities funeral pyres to burn their citizens' bodies that don't involve a crematorium. They're doing it the old-fashioned way, like the Vikings do in a boat. There are certain cultures like the Zoroastrians and Tibetans and other cultures that have sky burials that let nature take care of the corpse, or they literally, in Tibet, hand feed the vultures the remains of the body as an aspect of a last act of compassion to do something for a being with pretty much your useless corpse. There are also people who are getting mummified again, and they're having pyramids built where they shove their bodies in on land they buy. So there's a variety of industries that are coming out. I mean, there are actually people that get their remains shot into space. So I mean, the horizon is wide as to what people are doing with that last bit of hurrah to do something with their remains that's not just putting me in a pine box and sticking me, well, there's not even a pine box anymore. It's like a $1,200 casket. And a funny story about that, a lot of funeral directors are very morally driven people who have a high standard of practice. When I worked at the Keeney and Bassford Funeral Home in Frederick, Maryland, the funeral directors in the area of Maryland were at a convention, and they were literally roasting a funeral director from Rockville, Maryland, which is a really high-end, expensive, rich place. And they were only carrying like $6,000 to $8,000 cherry caskets. And the funeral directors are like, you know, it is a dead body. It's not like a Rolls Royce. Why are you charging $8,000 for like an $800 casket? So they were really taking them to task for creating this niche elitist market in the area that death had to be an expensive thing. And those funeral directors looked at that with utter disgust that that was being done. So there are a lot of them out there that are coming back to this idea of however you want to be presented and die, we'll make it as financially convenient as we can for you. And I'll end on that, and I'll open up the floor for whatever questions you got. Go for it, if you have any.
I have a comment and a question. One comment is my grandfather was in the 1918 flu epidemic, and his body was piled up with a lot of bodies in Idaho.
Yeah.
So I grew up with the picture of my Italian grandfather ending up as a body.
Potter's Field.
Piled.
Yeah.
I mean, just the idea
Yeah.
of hearing it was piled was shocking to me because, you know, that's so unlike anything else that you would carefully relate to with the bodies.
Yeah.
The question is, with this horrendous thing going on with school shootings, is there a positive in awareness of impermanence regarding this, because it happens so often and nothing seems to be done in a big way? So ultimately the society is changing. Do you see something then coming out and building a new layer of awareness of, you know, now you send your child to school and you're hoping they're going to come home again? Nobody ever had that before.
Well, it really, obviously 2001 with 9/11, that's where we really saw the consciousness of the U.S. take notice of death coming home to roost, with thousands of people dying in an instant. The American public of that generation from really the 60s on, because Vietnam was over there, Desert Storm was over there, Beirut, you know, is always over there, but the corpses are brought back. Now you have buildings collapsing and people going down, and literally there not being any corpse was really a shock to the sensibility of the American public. And really, when I was in Maryland, down the road from where it happened in DC, and as a religious leader, I did a public panel discussion, and I said, I don't know what you expect. This is reality. The fact that you think it's shocking, that shows you're in complete denial of the way life is. This is a wake-up call for you to reflect on the fact of that could be any one of you any instant. You should really use this as an epitaph to start thinking about impermanence and death in your own life, and not then move it into revenge and completely disregard the real emotions involved with it. And of course I was met with a lot of anger and rejection at saying that, but you know, I said nothing can come from lashing out at this. You're not dealing with death in a proper way. That's not a constructive way to deal with it. And we've seen that repeatedly over time, that doing that serves no purpose socially. And as we see now in the predicament we're in, 17 years later, it's just death, 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 trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. And nobody's talking about the reality of impermanence. You know, it's all about, you know, focusing on other things. So it's really a red herring as opposed to dealing with the reality of impermanence. And we also see, like you said, with the school shootings in the the nightclub shooting in Orlando and these mass killings, with multiple people, children being killed and 20-some-year-olds, that of course shocks people because they're in this mindset, oh, you're young, you got plenty of years ahead of you. No, that's not a reality, and you shouldn't adopt that way of thinking. You should never think you're invulnerable in any shape or form. Anybody can walk across the street to the library here and be plastered by somebody texting while they're driving down the road. You should never think you're safe no matter what. I don't mean you gotta be paranoid, but I just watched a video last night. Some woman was in a restaurant chopping up vegetables at the end of the night. The cook walked over and took a meat cleaver to her and chopped her head off. So it's like she's just going about her day, not thinking anything's going on. That's the end of that. So, never not be wary of the fact. Every day you wake up is an amazing day that you have something to do and can be productive, and start to think about, okay, if I walk out the door and let's say like a chunk of crap from a plane going overhead is expelled out and I get hit on the head with it, what a way to go. But, think about what would you want written on your tombstone if something like that happened. You got to approach it with a sense of humor and a sense of almost dark comedy, because that's what life can be in the long run sometimes, because it's so ridiculous. You have to laugh or you'll just cry.
Well, in that instance, keep looking up.
Go ahead. Okay. Yeah, so the... Yeah, go ahead.
When my dad died in December of 1977, he had expressed his desire that his body be donated for scientific research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you find that occurring more today, or?
Well, what's happening is a lot of people are so poor and can't afford to pay for their funeral. That's what they're doing. And although they're helping out society in the long run, that's really a pathetic reflection on society, that you have to have your corpse donated and dissected by, medical students to be able to even be paid to be rightfully buried. So there's a lot involved with the corpse that is continuing to grow, and we're finding that also there's a lot of problems with the illegal black market with organ trade. So that's going on, of course, and there have been instances in hospitals where there are people that the doctors say are dying and are in a coma state and dying, and the person is aware. They don't have their brain hooked up and see that they're aware, and they're already talking about what they're going to do with his organs, and then the family comes in and says, stop what you're doing, and then the person wakes up later and tells what they were saying in the room. So I don't want to push paranoia and fear on people, but man, you better have your dots crossed what's going to happen with your body in the end, or have someone there to put their foot down and say, no, Alan wants to be taken to the woods and dumped out with the possums and bears to be eaten, or whatever. I have a friend who is a biologist in Alaska, and he just wants his body taken to the woods and just let the animals eat him. That's what he wants to do. He doesn't want any fuss or money spent on his useless corpse. That's his mentality. Now his kids are like, Dad, we're not going to do that. His ex-wife could care less, but nonetheless, that's what he wants done. Who's to say you shouldn't do that? The Zoroastrians used to have what's called towers of silence, where they would take the bodies, put them out there or around these big pits, and they would line them up, and they would leave the bodies there to be taken by nature and the creatures, So luckily, there's one photographer from India who has actually gotten pictures of some of the towers of silence, which is unheard of. There's, as far as I know, none in existence. This is the first person to ever have any images of a tower of silence with the bodies. I've contacted him, and as a thanatologist, I want copies of them, and I'll pay whatever money he wants to get them, because me as a researcher, that's incredibly important to have that cataloged and have that being able to be referenced to, because you might show that to someone, and that person would go, that's the coolest thing I've ever heard of. Can we do that around here? The Native Americans used to have burial grounds where they would put the bodies into a raised platform and nature would take care of them. Of course, as the conquerors or settlers, whichever term you want to use, came in, they would desecrate those areas. And it was like unbelievable to the natives that was being done. It's like, that's our ancestors and our corpses. And that also plays into a lot of what has taken place with some of the minorities in America, the Chinese, the Africans, the Hmong, various groups that have had to deal with areas where their ancestors are here when they were brought to this country or came here, being bought up by greedy developers and finding the bodies, and if they can get away with it, removing them and just plowing them over. There are a lot of places, ironically, that there are people having massive hauntings, unfortunately, in areas of living because they're built on top of burial grounds and cemeteries that were not excavated. So you literally are just, like in the movie Poltergeist, building a house on top of a cemetery. And there's a lot of new developments that are having terrible haunting problems because of it. So, the process of a rightful ritual and burial, literally like you see in a horror movie, is having effects upon the living, with the dead being extremely mad and haunting the living. So regardless of people's belief that, ghosts don't exist, well, there's whole, cascades of apartment complexes that'll disagree with you that deal with stealth on a daily basis.
Replace my body. Hey, that's a good idea.
Yeah. Sorry, that was a
No, the battery died. It's going to take me too much to replace it.
We have this new thing where you can buy an urn and it'll
turn into a tree.
That's
Yep.
what I want.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, perfect example. Yeah, no, just bury me and, do something positive with my corpse. Mm-hmm. In the certain circles in Japan, the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia, their bodies are almost always tattooed, and when one of their leaders die, they take the tattooed flesh and mount it. Mm-hmm. So they have a culture of preserving body mementos afterwards. I have a human skull called a kapala in Buddhism. So I have various pieces like that in bones and stuff that I use for reflection and in rituals to instill in me. Okay, we got 30 minutes. To instill in me and permanence and my own view of my oncoming death.
There's a church in Czech Republic.
Yep. The whole bones everywhere. Yep, one of the most beautiful places. I really look forward to someday going there.
Me too.
And taking 18 gigs of pictures.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is it possible for me to get a copy for your audio?
Yes.
I have to
Did you
pause at the
watch the
beginning,
Ken
I need
Burns
to-
or
Yes.
Rick Burns
Give me your
on
email
Death
address
and
or
Civil
whatever.
War? Came out 2 or 3
Make that
years
available
ago.
for you.
Yeah, that'd be.
I'm pretty sure I did.
Still recording.
I've seen so many documentaries, I can't keep them straight. They all kind of running together. We sat through in getting my degree, some days 8 hours of documentary and video viewings on death and ritual and cultures, and videos of people dying themselves. So we were fastballed. And I did my degree in less than 2 years. And so I went full time in the summertime with 13 classes. So I was there from 8 in the morning till 10 at night, 7 days a week. So I was hit with so much stuff, it's impossible for me sometimes to even separate it out.
All right.
This cathedral what does it have, bones of?
Yeah, it was from.
Yeah, it's a
the Black
necropolis.
Death.
They gathered all the bones in the areas and what went on
From
and
the
created,
Black Death.
yeah, the Black Death, and they've created chandeliers, cabinets, whole caves, staircases, and it's nothing but just bones. I can get you the name of the video on it, and when you go to the library, you can go on YouTube and punch it in, and multiple videos will pop up, and you can just watch one after the other of these beautiful places.
Is that the one in Czechoslovakia?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah,
That's really awesome what they did.
yeah, it's incredibly beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, well, that used to be normal in even like 1800s culture in like Europe. You know, like I said, the cemeteries and necropolis, bodies were put into like, you'd have a table with skeletons playing poker. Or you'd have them doing natural stuff they would do in life. And people would walk around with their parasols and just, oh my gosh, look at that one. You know, it was no big deal. You would go and have picnics in the cemeteries. It wasn't this like, you know, oh my gosh, you know, I don't want to go to the cemetery. It was like, oh cool, we're going to the cemetery this weekend. And that's how it should be. I mean, every morning when I would take my wife, you know, to work, very first thing, my daughter and I went up the Woodlawn, you know, and hung out there as often as we could. Woodlawn's a beautiful place. It's relaxing, it's nice, it's a great energy. You know, it's a great sight to see. And it's a good reminder. I'm just a walking corpse.
Where is Woodlawn?
In between Brown and Wayne.
Okay, in
Brown
Dade
Street.
Yeah.
Not here.
No. Yeah, there's only a couple here in Fairborn. There's of course the one that's off of New Germany Trebein out there by the soccer fields.
The pet cemetery, is that?
It might have pets out there. I know there's a large Jewish community because of the way that the headstones look when they're buried, that specific sect does that, and they bought land to do that on. So there's a variety of places.
By Trebein and Dayton Yellow Springs.
Yeah, you go out in Dayton Yellow Springs, take a right on Trebein,
Okay.
and right there on the left, and it's a beautiful area back there. It really goes back far, and they've actually bought a lot of land, and there's a lot of new stuff that's been built with beautiful mausoleums and entombment areas. So there's some people putting some big money into their tombstones and such out there. Very beautiful to look at.
Would you comment on curriculum in the schools and the age associated with bringing in Buddhism and the other religions, but teaching about death and dying? And at what age?
3. They've already done studies on the ability for children to recognize death and passing. 3 to 4, they already know what's going on. It really is the parents that dumb down the child's ability to deal with death, because children incredibly resilient and bounce back like nothing's going on if they're allowed to mourn and express and grieve correctly the way that they want to about the death. You know, well, grandmother's sleeping. Worst thing you could tell a child. No, grandmother's dead. She's passed on. That's just a dead body. She's no longer in there. Of course, you have other religious aspects of it, but the healthy thing for a child is there's impermanence. Yes, you will die too one day. It's okay. Yes, mommy and daddy will also die one day. We're not going to go anywhere anytime soon, because when they do deal with death, they have a fear that everybody around them is going to die all of a sudden, and you can have some attachment issues with them being too attached to their parents out of fear of being abandoned or leaving them. And if you even leave the room, they get anxiety ridden after they deal with a death, because they think like, now grandpa's going to die, mom's going to die, Rover's going to die. You know, so it just depends.
Yes, well, you're anxiety ridden. If you're from a small town like I was, and growing up and going to horror movies on a Friday night, you reinforce something. And if you don't have some kind of underpinning about death and dying, and you take on the horror movies, and then you take on the horror for real that goes on in the world today, you are operating at a deficit of, and so to have something that complements or actually does the job for the parents, but a go-to person to talk about that. So if grandma or grandpa dies at home and then the child doesn't get some kind of help, that in the school, that there is something so that there's a regular kind of a companionship that helps out with that subject.
See, here, this is the crux of the problem, because I've dealt with this and we study it in thanatology and we know what the problem is. Religious and non-religious parents. That's the problem, because they think when you come in to talk about death, oh, what are you going to indoctrinate my... It ain't about that. You know, it's like when you say, we want to have a study of morals. I'm going to teach my kid morals at home. Okay, well, if they act like you're probably going to fail, you know. And teaching children about impermanence and death, there's no religion in the world or philosophy that doesn't say you're not impermanent or going to die. Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, atheists, Satanists, it doesn't matter. Everybody's going to die. There's nobody except severely deluded people that think they're going to live on forever. So it's a base philosophy of every single person in the world. Now, above and beyond that, what happens afterwards? Okay, well, this is what a lot of people say. You know, you find out what you want to believe and you look into it. I'm not saying one or the other is right. I'm saying here's a whole cavalcade of what various people say. You could look into or ask your parents or ask your clergy or whatever, or don't ask anybody. You think when you die, you're in the ground and that's it. Okay, now go live your life.
You know, can't you imagine a game, a grandiose game of hide and seek that plays around with being and non-being? In nursery school, I mean, if you said 3 or 4, you know, a really light way that addresses something so heavy.
Well, that's Ring Around the Rosie. That's because of the bubonic plague. Ring Around the Rosie, the bumps, pocket full of posies, because the smell was supposed to fight off the stench of death. That's why the plague doctors wore those masks. They had flowers and herbs stuck under that was supposed to filter out the stench of death. That's why they would go in with those full body covering suits. It was to prevent the infection from the plague. Didn't always work. Yeah, that's where those come from. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah, ashes, because of burning the bodies, we all fall down. Yeah, it was a childhood invention in a rhyme because of the reality of death. Okay, let's make it a childhood song. That's incredibly smart and that's effective in dealing with death. Ignoring it and denying it, that's not effective. Like really with any emotion, you stuff it back down, like with shaking up a soda bottle, it's going to blow up sooner or later. You can't deny your emotions. Human beings can't do that. We're not automatons.
It's too bad there's not an explanation. I played that game. Nobody ever told me that it was about death, and they told me I would have been better off with the people that I've lost along the way.
Well, just like that nursery, the worms crawl in. There's a whole poem to that. Yeah. That's about like, you know, when you see a hearse coming down the road, don't laugh. That could be you next. Yeah, yeah. You know, my funeral directors made me memorize that while we were driving around picking bodies up.
Yeah, yeah. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tina Collins now.
Yep. All right, no more questions. We'll call it a close. Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you so much.